A glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the 7 Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together right here in our very favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub and prepare to dive into mysterious and fascinating prehistory, from Clovis bone needles of the American West to the ancient mammoth kill sites left behind by our Paleo-Indian forebears. Glad as always to be here. I am Micah Hanks, and of course joined by Mr. 7 Ages, Jason Pentrail, my newly retired and soon-to-be employed but currently authoring a book colleague. Sir, how are you?
Well, on that note, very busy. So, as they say, when you retire, some people just go sit on the beach and enjoy a nice drink. Me, on the other hand, take this little window of opportunity I have before I start my next career to bury myself in research, lots of books, lots of documents, lots of papers coming across the desk, catching up on all the things that I haven't had time to do in the last 5-6 years. So I love it. It's fun. Yes, I am working on my second book right now. I'm about halfway through, and very excited about that process. And of course, things like the Crosstime Pub over there on Patreon, the Digging Deeper podcast, all the things we offer there, keeping me busy as well. But yeah, the retired life is very good indeed, and something I highly recommend.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm not sure if I will ever retire. I may try to take a vacation this year. Haven't done one of those officially in quite a while. But, you know, if I actually got some time off, what I'd probably be doing is kind of like what you've been doing. I'd probably have a stack of science papers, a couple of books I've been meaning to read now for months, if not years. I'd have my nose firmly planted in those, although I might be doing that sitting on a beach with a cocktail. Right? Best of both worlds.
Yeah, you can't complain about that. Take advantage while you can. So, yeah, you know, that transition between military life and then here, civilian life's been very nice. More time with the family, more time with the kids, getting to do some volunteering out there at their schools and share some of the stuff that we do here on 7 Ages. You know, Micah, I've actually been really proud because recently I was able to go to my oldest son's school and speak to a 3rd grade class about fossils, and we talked about archaeology, and I was able to do that under the banner of 7 Ages. So it was really the first time that 7 Ages as an entity was able to go into the public school system and talk a little bit about not only everything that the kids were really interested in, but also what 7 Ages does and how we are, you know, science communicators and educators. And, you know, I got to say, I got to brag on those 3rd graders. They had some excellent questions. I mean, they really thought about the presentation and everything that I was showing them. And then they would follow up with really insightful questions. And I was really, really proud of our students there in the 3rd grade at the local elementary school, really stepping up. And, you know, afterwards, I had parents contacting me, people from the school, talking about how much their kids enjoyed that interaction and learning something about their local area. And we got a ton of great feedback from the parents, from the school board, from the school system. So it was a great opportunity for 7 Ages.
That is really exciting news. I don't think there's probably anything quite as important as reaching out to those young minds, getting them interested in science or, you know, in the arts or something else. I'll never forget Lee Metcalf, who had been my teacher of the strings program when I was in first middle school and then on up through high school. I studied violin for 6 years under Lee Metcalf, and then after I graduated, we were still in touch, and he even played a couple of gigs with the band on upright bass. But, you know, he was always so inspirational. Before I was in middle school, though, I was a 5th grader at Sandhill Elementary School, And he showed up one day and he showed all the students what the violin, what the viola, what the cello, and then what the big upright bass sounded like. And at that moment, while most of the kids were eager to jump into the marching band, at that moment I knew I wanted to be a string kid, right? And I already played guitar at that point, but I mean, studying and having some formal training in classical music, it improved tenfold my guitar playing. And then when I would bring my guitar in, he would say, well, now let's apply the theory I'm teaching you on violin over to this instrument. So it really goes to show when kids are young and they maybe are still sort of finding themselves, it can make all the difference in the world when an expert comes in with a passion for knowledge and their craft. And even if the children haven't yet discovered that discipline, whether it's archaeology like what you were teaching, or if it's history, or it's music, or anything else, once they have that fundamental exposure to knowledge, that can set the pace for the rest of their lives. I'll tell you something else I loved when I was a child. I didn't become a geologist, but I used to love to go to those rock and mineral shows. And again, that passion still carries over to this very day. But on that subject of geology, where is James Waldo?
He's at home, washing his tights.
That's right, James Waldo. Slacking on the job. Actually, he's probably literally at work right now, but not able to join us today because he has been getting over one of those respiratory things that goes around this time of the year. He'll be back in action again soon.
Yeah, and those things are no fun. I've been through that here just recently myself. I don't know what I got this year, but it's the worst I've had in probably a decade. And so, James, we hope you feel better soon, buddy, and we'll see you back here at the Crosstime Pub before you know it. But, speaking of respiratory, smells, all those type of things that are in that family, Micah, have you ever wondered what it might be like to smell an Egyptian mummy?
Yeah, your transition was even better than the one I was going to try and sneak up on you. So I guess you've gotten your sense of smell back since that sickness, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a new paper out, and this is coming from Archaeology magazine, talking scientists investigate the smell of Egyptian mummies. Now, in the world of archaeology, there's all sorts of things that you can come across. Wine that's hundreds or thousands of years old that may still be sealed, burial remains, mummies, all sorts of possibilities when you're doing an excavation. But when you're talking about the smell of the mummy, it's not something that maybe comes to the forefront of the conversation. So many times with these coffee table books with all the pictures of the mummies and these wonderful TV shows and programs where they're filming the mummies and showing all the tombs and all the burial goods that go along with that, you never think about, there is an actual body there. What does that smell like? Does that create a disturbance? Does that create an offensive odor? Well, Cairo, Egypt, ancient Egyptian mummies smell apparently woody, spicy, and sweet. Now, that's according to a statement released by the University College of London. And for the first time, an international team of researchers has systematically studied the smells of mummified bodies using sensory technology, including, Micah, this is a new one on me, an electric nose.
My.
And this, yeah, right. Welcome to 2025. And the skills of expert human sniffers, revealing new details about mummification and the process that's attached to it. Now, a gas chromatograph was used in combination with mass spectrometry to analyze chemical molecules that are being emitted from 9 bodies housed within the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Now, the study determined that the pleasant odors were a product of coniferous oils and resins. Now, that included things such as pine, cedar, juniper, as well as gum resins such as frankincense and myrrh, those popular ones that everyone's heard about. Now, they were used during the mummification. Now, the smell was an important factor for ancient Egyptians, as pleasant aromas were associated with deities and with purity, while less enjoyable smells were linked with bodily corruption and decay. So the smell of mummified bodies has for years attracted significant interests from experts with that sweet, woody, and as they described, spicy smell. So Micah, now we know the next time we see a magazine article, a National Geographic show, or any other publication that we can kind of envision along with that mummy case, what that smell might actually be, being woody, spicy, and sweet. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I'm going to have to rethink how I would have envisioned those old horror films of yesteryear. You know, the frightening mummy comes stumbling out and you're standing there going, oh my God, oh, wow, you smell wonderful, but you're terrifying. Although I also sort of remember some sort of reference. Again, I read a lot of Egyptology books, especially back when I was around middle school age. I was just fascinated with it and went through this whole period of just checking out all these books and reading all about, you know, the discovery of Tutankhamun and things like this. And somewhere along the way, I do seem to recall some sort of reference to entering tombs and there being this, I think how it was described was like a sickly sweet kind of aroma. And I always figured that that was just maybe the scent of the ages and of decay. It very well may actually have been that they were detecting sweet, woody aromas that were associated with both the purification and the cleansing, but also the preservation methods that would have been used at the time that those mummies were laid to rest. So it's sort of fascinating to figure that, yeah, instead of the decrepit scent, the stench of the eons, these mummies actually smell kind of okay. That's going to be a new scent, right, that they're going to offer from Old Spice. Old Mummy.
Or just kind of okay.
Yeah, kind of okay mummy musk. Hey, I got one for you here. Check this out. So, we've been following the story now for a few years of what initially were some controversial discoveries, ichnofossils or trace fossils left down there at White Sands. And by this, of course, we mean footprints. They aren't actually fossils of organisms. These are fossilizations that represent where an organism once was. And in this case, there were a couple in question. There were humans. There were also some extinct Pleistocene megafauna like giant sloths. But the important thing about these footprints was the controversial claim initially that radiocarbon dating had determined that evidence, I believe in the form of seeds and spores that were left in the footprints, seemed to point to them being between 22 and 23,000 years old. And, understandably, some archaeologists said, hold on, there are other ways that those kinds of dates could have been produced, especially if we are relying on the remnants of vegetation to draw those dates. Specifically, certain plants will take, nutrients and things up through their soil, and if you actually date portions of that biological material, sometimes you can actually date the material that they brought up back when those plants were alive, and it may actually give you an incorrect date, as opposed to the actual period in which those footprints were made. Well, back in 2023, there was an update to this, and it was more conclusively determined that indeed these footprints appear to date back to 23,000 years old, and now with additional corroboration, it seems pretty clear-cut, and not a huge surprise to me that people would have been here that long ago. There's actually been an abundance of evidence, in my opinion, that points to an earlier human presence in North America, and really throughout the Americas. But now, we have additional information about what they may have been doing and what kinds of technologies some of those ancient North Americans at White Sands may have been using, specifically travois-like sleds. In other words, this is a crude kind of a sled that can be a couple of poles, sometimes forming an X. You tie them in the center, and then you can place some objects on a little crossbeam, and you can drag that along behind you. And experts have said that in addition to the human ichnofossils, one can understand why, again, the footprints are going to be the thing that is of greatest interest to most archaeologists and anthropologists. But when you see these little lines in the sand, so to speak, there had been others who said, well, what's that? Were they dragging something? Now the interpretation of the dragging is that indeed they may have been pulling along behind them anything from supplies to maybe meat that was obtained from butchering at a kill site. We aren't sure. We probably will never know exactly what they were carrying. But again, these new findings by Bournemouth University researchers Matthew Robert Bennett, Sally Christine Reynolds, and a few others definitely seems to point to the kind of technology. And again, they refer to this in a new paper that was published about this as ancient transport technology. Now, naturally, when people see a headline like ancient transport technology, you start thinking about carts, things with wheels, maybe some kind of a contrivance that's pulled by animals. In this case, we're talking about something that is fairly crude, and I'll point out that 18,000 years or so after this was apparently taking place down there at White Sands and across the world in ancient Mesopotamia, it was about 5,000 years ago, as far as we know, that the first use of the wheel actually emerges. So these ancient North Americans weren't doing anything quite that complicated. But it is still fascinating to get a perspective on the kinds of simple technologies that they would have used. And again, in this instance, this is really neat because the perishable technologies that would have been used, poles, sticks, things like this, as we know, Jason, you're never going to find direct evidence of those perishable technologies, your basketry, your structures, if they were made from wood and things like that. You may find evidence of stone structures. But again, the Paleo-Indian hunters of North America, they certainly, as far as we know, weren't making stone structures. We haven't found any kind of remnants of structures with datable material that can convincingly show that that kind of structure was being built by those ancient Americans. But to find ichno-fossil trace evidence of those technologies where the perishable technologies no longer remain, and that still seemingly gives us a window into how they lived and the kinds of things that they did, the contrivances they used to help them carry quite literally the load of their lifestyle in those early ancient days, 22,000 years ago. It's just fascinating to me.
So everyone who's listened to the program for any length of time will know that we have a very strong focus on that time period, the peopling of Americas, and every year there's more and more information coming out. In the last 3 to 4 years, I would say there's been more papers than I can remember, just almost on a monthly basis of groundbreaking research. And, the person we're talking to tonight, Spencer Pelton, he is the state archaeologist for Wyoming, and he is fascinating. He's got so much to tell us tonight about the Prele site. This is a mammoth kill site. There's so much more to it than that, though. They've really done justice to the site. They've expanded the excavation outside of the main focus of the mammoth, and doing so has created an incredible amount of data that's being gathered. So Spencer is going to catch us up on all of the details of Prele, its history, and where it's at and where it's going to be going in the future. Absolutely fascinating interview. Spencer Pelton, the state archaeologist for Wyoming, a fascinating conversation. Tonight on the Seven Ages Audio Journal, we welcome Dr. Spencer Pelton. Dr. Pelton is the Wyoming State Archaeologist and an adjunct professor of anthropology at the University of Wyoming. Spencer has maintained a varied career in federal and state government, private and academic sectors, working in Tennessee, North Carolina, California, Nevada, Colorado, and Wyoming during his 17-year career. Spencer is a field archaeologist at heart and spends most of his summers excavating Wyoming archaeological sites. He maintains research interests in the peopling of America, but his field projects are increasingly focused on the latest prehistory and earliest history of the Wyoming High Plains and Rocky Mountains. In addition to his academic and field research, Spencer is interested in the politics of heritage preservation and writes about that topic extensively on his Substack newsletter, Social Stigma. Spencer lives in Laramie with his wife, Hallie, and daughter, Maisel. Dr. Pelton, welcome to the Seven Ages Audio Journal.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
No problem. The Prele site, the Mammoth site out there, is part of an expanding group of interest that we have here on Seven Ages. Again, we follow Paleo-Indian studies here very closely. We have since the advent of the show, and Wyoming keeps coming up in articles. It keeps coming up in research papers. So there's a lot to learn about that state, and it's one area that we really haven't been able to focus on so much to this point on the show. So we're very much looking forward to learning more about this very prevalent site and all of the great things that it's producing. So for those of us who may be here on the East Coast and throughout the southeastern United States, give us a little bit of the background in history surrounding this incredible site known as the Prele Mammoth site. Tell us a little bit about that.
Prele was discovered back in the mid-1980s by a couple avocational archaeologists, paleontologist types out of the town of Douglas, Wyoming. Small town, 6,000 people, but it's got the North Platte running right through it. And of course, wherever there's a big body of water, there's usually a lot of archaeology. So these guys kind of clued into that and started systematically walking stream banks, arroyo cuts, places where the stream had eroded into a really tall deposit of alluvium, and that you might stand a chance of finding some old stuff. So these guys were actually out there specifically looking for old archaeology or old paleontology, and ran across these big bones coming out of this creek bank about 10 feet below the surface and about another 10 feet above the creek itself, and right in the middle of this big sequence of Pleistocene alluvium. So really, there's no other bones like mammoth bones. There's nothing else that really reaches that size in North America during the Pleistocene, at least. So they knew exactly what they had when they found it, and they reached out to the Department of Anthropology, which at that time, George Frizen was really kind of the main archaeologist in the department at that time at University of Wyoming. So over the spring break of 1987, George mustered up this group of volunteers. They went out there, hand dug down to the mammoth bones where they were coming out, and over the period of a few days excavated this 12 square meter block and recovered partial remains of a juvenile mammoth. And in the process, they found what they thought was a hammerstone and a flake tool, a couple really small flakes, and got pretty excited about it. Mammoth kills are some of the rarest archaeological sites in the world, really. There's only maybe 15, 16 of them in North and South America, and then not that many in the Old World either. So they kind of started hatching plans to get back out there, but in the process came into some conflicts with the private landowner of the site, and basically just shut out from the site for a really long time. And it wasn't until the early 2010s when the University of Wyoming was able to get back into the site and start conducting some more systematic research on it, with primarily through the Wyoming Archaeological Field School at first, but then through a series of paid crews after that. And since then, it's just kind of kept growing and yielding more and more surprises year after year, the more we dig at the site.
Yeah.
And we ultimately phased out our research there this last summer. So we're going to let the site rest for a while we kind of catch up and writing everything up.
Well, yeah, no, that makes sense. It's there's so much detail, so much data to be had on a site like this for sure. And now that period of time between Frizen and then I believe 2014 was the University of Wyoming Field School. Was the site being preserved during that time, or did you basically have to start all over with the data sets in 2014?
It was preserved through that time. Yeah, we had the mammoth bones and the small number of stone artifacts here at the university and the University of Wyoming Archaeological Repository. We didn't have really many field notes from it. We had a few. We had some photos. But really, this was based on like 5 days of real excavation, right? They didn't really do a whole lot of work there in the 80s. So when we picked up in the 2010s, really all we were wanting to do was establish whether or not this was a mammoth kill, because they're just so rare and every one of them really counts for a lot for that reason. And so our primary objectives going back were just, let's find some artifacts in association with these mammoth bones and call it good. And then through a series of kind of serendipitous circumstances, we ended up discovering that the site was far larger than we had ever anticipated.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. And again, the data keeps stacking. And as these things sometimes do, the site began to sort of move out from the central mammoth site to surrounding areas of what looks like campsites where people may have been around that particular kill. So let's talk a little bit about that. The 2014 University of Wyoming Field School, you're coming back in after all this time from an initial excavation in the 1980s. I want to focus on this for just a moment because we're dealing not only with going back to reinvestigate an established site, but we're also looking at how much archaeology may have changed between the original investigation and excavation into what we see in 2014. So when you're making a game plan, per se, to go back into a site like La Prele this many years later, how do you begin to a plan of attack, if you will, based off of where it was in the 80s versus how you would approach it in 2014?
It's a good question. The first thing we had to do was find the old excavation, right? And we had a general sense of where it was. There's a big hole in the ground still in 2014 from the 1980s, but we didn't know exactly where that 3 by 4 meter excavation unit was. So the first thing we did when we went back out was, well, we put in some spatial control. We put in concrete datum so that we could actually have some spatial control that didn't change in the next, several decades. And then we set out trying to find the excavation. The way we did that was we shoveled down to where we thought about the excavation was, and we started putting augers in. And with those augers, we were able to actually find the floor of the 1980s excavations, because you're augering through all this slump and all these kind of modeled sediments, and then all of a sudden you hit this intact alluvium, and they're like, okay, that's it. That's the floor of the excavation. So then we had an elevation, right? So we could shovel down to that. We found the excavation floor, and then we just started shoveling out from that, and we're able to actually find the corner nails from the 1980s excavation and align our grid to that. So then that was done. That's great. A couple of things that had changed since the 80s, really just the precision of excavation that we do. In the 80s, they did 1 by 1 meter units. That was actually pretty good for the time. When we went back, we did 50 by 50 centimeter quadrants within those units. And we also set up a water screen on the site so that every bit of sediment that came out of the excavation, we could put through this 16th inch window mesh and find all those really tiny artifacts that we really rely on to create these spatial these associations between humans and mammoths. The vast majority of the artifacts we recovered from La Prele during the first several years of investigation were about 2 millimeters long. They were very tiny retouch flakes that were taken off of formal stone tools, knives, and bifaces and things like that. And so the water screening was really a key component of being able to expand the site in the way we did, because we could pick up on these really, really subtle cultural features that are comprised of primarily micro debitage, where people were sitting around a campfire, like, retouching their stone tools. And of course, it eventually also led to us finding bone needles, which are more or less impossible to find if you're not using recovery techniques like that.
No, absolutely. And again, that precision has led to the paper that we will be discussing here tonight. This is Early Paleo-Indian Use of Canids, Felids, and Hairs for Bone Needle Production at the La Prele site in Wyoming, USA. That is the paper that is available now. And so, as we always do, we encourage everybody, go look it up. We're going to put that link there in the show notes so that everybody can follow along with this. I think, again, this is one of those things that continues to add to the previous year's research on Paleo-Indian, Clovis, all of those things that we're so interested in from that time period, and then moving up into the early Archaic. These type of things and this type of precision is certainly warranted. So before we get into the fine details of the paper, just for those, again, who may not have heard of La Prele previously, ultimately, give us an overview of, what was found centrally and then what was found surrounding it as far as human interaction. What does the site kind of look like in totality?
I'd like to share the story of how we actually started expanding the site, because it's a pretty funny story. The first year we went back, we went with the field school. It was their first site a lot of them had ever been on, and we had them piece plotting these tiny flecks of bone and charcoal and really finding very little for days. And then, of course, on like day 9, our camp cook, Rich Adams, who's also a doctor of archaeology out of Wyoming, that tags along with the field school and helps out the field school, or at least did at that time. He was maintaining a trail we had cut along this arroyo face down to the water screens. He's just using a flat shovel to kind of whittle back the face of the arroyo so that people could carry these heavy buckets down to the water screen from the excavation block. So he's working his way along the bank, chiseling away at it with a flat shovel through this really fine-grained alluvium, and then all of a sudden, clank, he hits something big. There aren't big rocks in this sediment. There shouldn't be. It's this overbank alluvium. So he cleared the sediment away from this thing that made the big clank, and turned out to be a chopper. It's this cobble tool with a few flakes taken off of one end, right in the same stratigraphic position as the mammoth, but also about 15 meters south of the mammoth. So this was really the moment that gave us hope that there was a site here, and started making us think that there's a lot more to this mammoth kill than just a dead mammoth, and that there might be some other components to it. So the next summer we opened up a block around that chopper, found a big ochre stain, first bone needles. The next summer we started testing along in a bigger area, found more concentrations of artifacts. And then every year we've just tried to then slowly chase that out further and further away from this mammoth until today, when now we have a campsite that spans an acre to 2 acres in size. It's associated with at least 5, if not closer to 10 harsh-centered activity areas, probably the floors of houses. So it looks like people probably killed a mammoth here, and then they sat on it for a little while. They set up houses, they processed hides, they sewed clothing, they flint knapped, they did all the things a Pleistocene hunter-gatherer did at that time around this mammoth. And it ended up being just this really beautiful snapshot of life at the end of the Pleistocene in Wyoming, not just a mammoth kill, but everything that goes along with a Paleolithic campsite.
And so again, that kind of makes us reimagine what we think we know about these early hunter-gatherers. I sort of always envision them quickly moving. During that time period, maybe the meat would stay fresh for maybe up to a week, maybe longer, depending on if they were smoking something or whatever the case may be. But this really sort of gives us more insight, and it makes me wonder of the other sites that have been found in North America, whether it's, something like Dent or the Colby site or any of them that are well known. Are any of those features present there that maybe haven't been discovered yet? It's something to really consider, being that as you move this site out, that's what you ran into. I'd really be interested to see in the future if there's any further investigation that kind of see if any of those other famous sites correspond with what you're finding at La Prele. What do you know about that as far as from your experience?
I think it's pretty likely. My colleague Madeline Mackey did her dissertation in part on this issue, which is that when archaeologists have excavated mammoths in the past, they tend to just stop where the mammoth bone stops. And they say, we got a mammoth kill. But what this suggests is that maybe you should keep going and at least make some proactive effort to see if there's other archaeology buried in the same stratigraphic context as that mammoth. Because, if you kill a mammoth, it's going to take a little while to deal with that animal. It's going to probably take at least a week to break it down, process the meat so it doesn't spoil. And that's going to require building a house and probably, keeping your family fed and keeping them busy for an extended amount of time. So I think you would expect to find these sorts of campsites around dead mammoths if there's a mammoth kill. And the only reason we haven't found them is because they're really hard to find. I mean, we were not aware of the extent of this site until pretty recently, last couple of years, when we really started putting a lot of concerted effort into finding the edge of the site. And so, it's a difficult thing to do. I'd like to think that maybe we've set a bit of a precedent with La Prele and how we've dealt with it, that maybe in the future people will start, following our lead a little bit and trying to chase out these sites and really explore all the little nuances of how people killed these animals and dealt with them after the fact.
No, it's certainly commendable what's going on at La Prele. And again, that's just an overview of the site. What we're actually here to talk about tonight is the results of that very fine investigation, excavation techniques, really taking their time, moving through, the sifting and all of the things that go into a really detailed excavation. So again, the paper is Early Paleo-Indian Use of Canids, Felids, and Hares for Bone Needle Production at the La Prele site, and that's in Wyoming, USA. This paper is available right now, PLOS One. It has a publishing date of November 27th, 2024, so this is easy to find. I do want to begin here at the introduction of the paper, just so it kind of lets everybody know what it is that will be the heart of our discussion tonight. And it begins here on the paper under introduction. Thermoregulation was a fundamental constraint on the pacing and character of global modern human dispersal. Modern humans are primarily physiologically adapted to the climates of sub-Saharan Africa, where much of their evolutionary lineage exists. So expansion into northern latitudes required the adoption of technologies that buffered early modern humans against increasingly severe cold conditions. Of the various technologies and behaviors enacted to cope with cold temperatures, complex tailored garments are among the most important. So this is what we're talking about here. Again, that attention to detail at La Prele has led to this paper, and specifically the presence of these bone needles. Now, I was excited when this first came out. That's why I immediately reached out to you. to have you on the show, but catch us up with this. Is this something that has occurred at other sites, or is this the very first indication of something like a bone needle on a mammoth kill site?
So we found bone needles at other Paleo-Indian sites. Off the top of my head, there's maybe a dozen to 20 Paleo-Indian contexts solely throughout the American west of the Mississippi River that have produced bone needles. And there's bone needles, of course, in other time periods during the North American prehistoric record, but they do seem more common in Paleo-Indian sites than in other contexts. Actually, Wyoming, I think, has a distinction of having more bone needles than any other state in the country. I think it's partly because, well, it's a very, very cold place to live, and so you need to sow a lot, but also we've been using this water screening technique, this really fine grain recovery technique, since the 1980s, if not the late 1970s. And so we've just conducted research in a way that's conducive to finding these things as well. I think, the site with the most bone needles that has ever been discovered is the Lindenmeyer Folsom site, which is just south of Laramie, where I'm sitting here in northern Colorado. There they found at least a couple dozen bone needles there. Again, about the same exact age as the La Prele site as well. The Hell Gap site has produced bone needles. The Agate Basin site in Wyoming has produced bone needles. They've also been found in a burial context in Idaho, the Buell burial. They've been found in Washington State in Paleo-Indian contexts, and several other places across the Great Plains. It is this kind of phenomenon, this Paleo-Indian phenomenon, primarily in the West, that you find these things. I think they certainly probably were used in the East as well. It's just the preservation conditions in Eastern North America are a lot poorer than they are in the West, due primarily to the climate and the soil conditions. So I think it's a more of a preservation issue than a behavioral kind of pattern that we find so many of these things in the West. The arid conditions we have are just really conducive to preserving things like this.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly being here on the East Coast, I understand exactly what you mean. Yeah, the conditions for preservation here are not always the best, to say the least. Now, we talk about thermoregulation. We talk about tailoring of garments. And so this, again, is giving great insight to this time period. Let's talk about that. So, again, we're seeing those increasingly colder temperatures. So what really would be the difference between, say, a tailored garment and just what we would envision as a draped garment? Where does the importance come in of these bone needles on the La Prele site as far as thermoregulation goes with these early people?
Well, there's a big difference between tailored and draped garments, and really just its capacity to insulate cold air away from the skin. So in the old world, I framed the study in this kind of grand narrative about kind of modern humans populating the northern reaches of Siberia. And for a reason, that's because bone needles first emerge in Siberia, associated specifically with modern humans around 40,000 years ago or so. Of course, there was already hominin species living on that continent before the Neanderthals and Denisovans and all these archaic hominins we know about. They almost certainly had some form of clothing, but it was probably draped clothing. It would be like maybe a robe, or just even just a fur that you drape around your shoulders, or something you tie around your waist. Those are useful for, say, bedding down in a cave during cold conditions. You can drape that over you, you can survive. But if you want to be out foraging throughout the cold months efficiently, then you need to have clothing that's actually form-fitting to your body, that keeps you warm, while you can also go about your life as a hunter-gatherer, go on hunts, maybe pull up in a hunting blind for several hours while you wait for an animal to come by. For that, you need some sort of fitted garments. And by fitted, what I mean is you need to have the garment actually sewed around your arms. You need to have it tucked up under your armpits. You need to have actual pants, probably, that conform to your legs. Maybe you even have underwear on that actually assists with this process a little bit. Your clothing probably has fringes around the sleeves to keep wind from cutting through the clothing. Probably has a hood with a fringe around it as well to keep wind off of your face. All these things combined really make it possible to live in some really extreme environments. And the analog that we use primarily as archaeologists is the clothing of the Inuit, that the Inuit made in the historic era and still make today. Clothing that is able to withstand the conditions of the Arctic. And when you're sitting over, for instance, like a hole waiting for a seal to pop its head out so you can spear it in the nose, you're going to need a pretty robust piece of clothing while you do that, and not just have like a blanket draped over your shoulders. And that's the sort of technology that really modern humans had to have if they were going to colonize Siberia. And, if you're a Bering Land Bridge hypothesis adherent like I am, eventually cross the Bering Land Bridge into the New World.
No, it all makes perfect sense. And again, it sort of fills in those gaps that we have when we're trying to envision these early hunter-gatherers moving across the landscape. So kind of honing in on those bone needles, what quantity are found there at La Prele during the excavation? And also importantly, what type of species are these? Are they mammoth? Are they hare? Obviously from the title of the paper, we see that there are multiple different types of animal, but kind of paint the picture of how those animals in the form of a bone needle ended up at a mammoth site. What that look like across a landscape?
We've got a lot of fragments of bone needles and what we call bone needle preforms from the site, like 3 dozen or so, I think. But we think that they comprise 4 bone needles and 2 preforms, because they're all coming out of these little tiny pieces. But through its context and their metric dimensions, and also this analytical technique we use, zooms, we were able to piece together that there's probably 6 unique artifacts there. We didn't know before doing this study what these things were made out of. It was kind of implicitly assumed that they were just made out of the bones of things that we find in Paleo-Indian sites, which are Paleo-Indian sites of this age, which is like 12,900 years old. It's pretty much mammoths and bison. The vast majority of faunal remains from sites of this age in Wyoming are mammoth and bison. So I think it was a fair assumption that these things are probably made out of mammoth or bison bone. So when the results came back and suggested that they're making these bone needles out of really small animals, it was a big surprise. I guess it kind of clearly, to a lot of folks, you would clearly make a bone needle out of a smaller animal bone than a bigger one because it's easier to work with those bones. But we never found really bones of those animals in Paleo-Indian sites before, so it wasn't really on our radar. So when these things came back as hare and red fox and some sort of cat, it really kind of made us recalibrate our ideas about what people were doing at these mammoth kill sites. So as I was talking about earlier, right, you kill a mammoth, it's going to take days to deal with that animal. But during that time, you're going to have a lot of downtime for a lot of folks in your camp to be doing other stuff. And I think one of the things they were probably doing is setting traps to catch these really small animals. This is something that children can do. It's a passive activity. So say if you're a woman in camp tasked with childcare, it's something that you could do while you do childcare as well. And it's this aspect of the Paleo-Indian economy that we've never really considered in great detail. But I think that having the presence of these animals really, at least for me, recalibrated my idea of what people were doing in these camps. They weren't just sitting there preparing for the next big game hunt. They were also probably setting trap lines and doing some of this other stuff. Beyond that, I guess, why would you trap these animals in the first place? Well, it's because they have furs. And all of these complex garments that we find, like, say, among the historic Inuit, they all have furs around the sleeves and the hoods. And those furs are really important for creating those fringes on these garments. It's just not something that you can create with, say, a bison skin or a deer skin or something like that. These fur-bearing animals have very tightly spaced hairs. They're out all winter, so they're physiologically adapted to coping with these temperatures. And so obtaining those furs would probably be a primary motivation for trapping these things, as opposed to trapping them for subsistence, for eating.
This is so fascinating that when we get back to the actual bones, the bone needles themselves, rather, as far as the size and the way that they're used, have they been looked at for microwear analysis? Is there any indication of what type of hide that they may have been moving through or materials that they might have been used on?
We haven't done any microwear analysis on them, no. We only have like one tiny tip. Most of these are just kind of like shaft fragments. So maybe you could get the microwear off of them, but I'm not certain about that. I think the presumption is they're being used to sew probably the furs of the animals that the bone needles were made out of. Because when you're using a needle, you're using it to create these really fine stitches. You can use an awl to produce a lot of aspects of clothing, right? You just kind of perforate the seam, and then you can hand thread the sinew through the holes that way. But when you're using a needle, you're actually doing things like sewing fringe on, or you're creating the really complicated stitching, say like around the armpit or like the crotch of a pair of pants or something, where you have to like kind of curve the stitching and keep it really tightly spaced. It's little small tasks like that I think these needles were primarily used for. I'd never done a lot of sewing. Actually, part of my qualifying exams for my PhD, they made me sew an Inuit garment because they wanted me to experience like what it was like to sew. I'd never really sewed very much. And it's really the straight seams like on the side of your pants, those are pretty easy to do. But really when you get to the parts where you have to curve the garment around like your arms and your legs and things like that, those are the really difficult seams to produce, and really where a bone needle would come in handy.
Absolutely. It's again, it's one of those things I've experimented with very little, but I appreciate anyone who has that skill, especially to do it by hand like that. Something else that I can't help but think about when we're talking about needles is the eye of the needle. So is there any indication with the eye of how they were able to achieve such a small hole? Are we looking at scraping, drilling? Is there any indication of how that eye of the needle was created?
There's been somebody else write about this. Alan Osborne wrote about creating bone needle eyes, and he thought that they were produced with these little tiny artifacts called gravers that we find in the Paleo-Indian record. We find these artifacts kind of in small numbers throughout the record, but in my experience, the ones from Paleo-Indian contexts are just smaller and more ubiquitous than in other contexts. So he thought that these little flake gravers, they're basically just a flake that has a little tiny projection flint napped onto it. He thought those were what they were using to incise the eye of the needle. I think he's probably right about that. I also think, though, that flake gravers are probably used to prepare seams for sewing as well. These needles they're very fragile, and a lot of the materials you'd be sewing with them, like say furs or bison hides, you can't really perforate those hides with the bone needle itself. It would just break too often. So I think these gravers were probably served a couple purposes, one of which was preparing seams for sewing with the bone needle. So you go through, you perforate, say 6 inches or a foot of your seam, and then you go back and use your bone needle to actually sew that seam together. So I think when you look in a lot of these Paleo-Indian contexts, you actually find bone needles and gravers in the same exact spatial context within these Paleo-Indian campsites. And I don't think that that's an accident. I think they're basically a paired artifact form where you need a graver to use a bone needle.
All of these things make so much sense when you actually look at it from a different perspective. Now, in the paper, figure 1, there is a layout of the site, and it's called Archaeological Plan Map of La Prele Blocks B and D, showing the locations of recovered bone needle fragments. So when we're looking here at the layout of the site on figure 1 in the paper, as far as where the bone needles are being located, for those listening and maybe can't see the paper right now, how close in proximity to the kill site are the bone needles being found?
Block B is that block that has a big ochre stain in it. It's probably the floor of a house. That's about 15 meters south of the Mammoth, as recollection serves. Block D, also very likely the footprint of another house. It's by far the most dense concentration of artifacts we found at the site, just tens of thousands of artifacts within this one little circular area, about 5 meters wide. That's about, if I had to guess, 25 meters southwest of the site or so. So say, block B about 45, 50 feet, block D, say like 60, 70 feet away. Yeah, just far enough so that maybe you can't get the stank of that mammoth in your house or something. I don't know.
That's exactly what I was thinking, actually. Kind of exactly where you would expect to find something like that. Give yourself a little bit of room there from the work area. Getting into the materials and methods, I also always find this part of papers to be very, very interesting. is the testing of the needles. So talk a little bit about how you went about determining the taxa of the needles themselves and just some of the testing on the site. I always think that's an important part of the story.
I'll try to talk about this. My co-authors can talk about it far more articulately than I can. Todd Servo was really the one that brought this method to the University of Wyoming. And then McKenna Latinsky and Sarah Alon, two of my co-authors, were the ones that really did the legwork on doing this analysis. But this is a method called zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry. It's ZOOMS, it's often called. It's an acronym. In a very basic way, what you do is you extract collagen from an artifact. You can use a very small amounts. They actually developed a non-destructive way to do this on these bone needles. So you just kind of soak the needle in a solution. It leaches out some collagen. You digest that collagen through a series of chemical processes, and then you shoot that collagen through a mass spectrometer, which produces a spectrum of peptides called marker peptides. So great, you get all this data from the archaeological record, but what is this spectrum? It has hundreds of different marker peptide peaks and valleys. How do you interpret that? So the way we did it is, thankfully, at the University of Wyoming, one of my colleagues, Danny Walker, he's a former assistant state archaeologist in Wyoming. He spent his entire career amassing this amazing comparative faunal collection at the university that just contains thousands of animals, all sorts of genera and species. So we had examples of all of these native animals in our basement, the bones of those animals, red fox and bobcat, lynx and mountain lion, wolf. We have eagles, we have a camel, we have an elephant. We just got all these different animals. And so we can then do that ZOOMS method on those comparative specimens to develop a reference collection of spectra for basically all the animals in the state. So then you got your archaeological spectra, you've got your comparative spectra, and through a series of quantitative analyses, you can match up those archaeological spectra to the reference spectra and with some degree of statistical certainty. So we can tell that a bone needle made out of a red fox bone is red fox because we have the spectrum from a red fox at our disposal. Really, the method is a couple different methods you can use, but the one that seems to be most reliable is there's these marker peptides. So specific genera have specific marker peptides associated with their spectra, and by using those, you can match up these things really well. That's the method we use. There is a degree of uncertainty to it. Some of these things you can get down to like a specific species. Other things you can only get really to a family level, and then some you can just get to a genus level. But it works pretty well. You can certainly tell the difference between, for instance, a bison and a red fox. They're very distinct using this method.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And again, I always like to discuss these methods because every year we see more and more innovative methods coming out for really realizing this type of data. And I think it's really exciting for the future of archaeology. Now, there's a lot of data here to unpack, but we've covered sort of the main idea, which is Prele producing these bone needle artifacts, and that being related back to that thermoregulation that we talked about at the beginning. So let's talk about some of the conclusions of the paper. Again, your study there was to identify the species and likely elements from which Paleo-Indians produced eyed bone needles. But ultimately, in your opinion, just kind of stepping back and looking at the site holistically and looking at the data that's been provided so far, have you had any light bulbs, if you will, any ideas about how to pursue a site like Prele? And you also mentioned that you had a lot of data that you need to catch up on. So is there any other types of paper or data that may come out of Prele in the near future?
Oh, yeah, we're going to be milking Prele for all it's worth for a long time. I think there's a lot of artifacts to deal with. And it just keeps yielding really surprising insights. So I don't know, one of my favorite conclusions of this study in particular was, we hadn't really talked about it yet, but we're pretty sure that these bone needles are made out of the metapodials of these animals, so the foot bones. And why that's significant is that we don't have bones of these animals in the site other than these needles. We don't have like rabbit or bobcat or red fox vertebra or ribs or crania. We just have the bone needles, which are probably, I think, made out of foot bones. And the reason we think that is we did some micro CT scanning and kind of compared the metric attributes between bone needles and several bones out of these animals' bodies. And really, the metapodials are just exactly the right length, exactly the right thickness, so that you could kind of incise down each side of these things, split them apart, and whittle them down a little bit, and then you got a bone needle. The light bulb associated with that was really about trapping. So when you're trapping animals, people still do this today. You trap an animal, you don't take that entire animal away from the trap. You skin it out in the field, but you typically cut the feet off once you get the skin down to the end of the legs, because you can't really work the skin or the fur away from all the tiny little bones in the feet. So you skin the animal out, you lop them off at the feet, and you take that skin back to camp. So what that said to us was that these bone needles are basically being taken out of the skins that are being brought back to camp from these trapping activities. Because you could just take one of those little foot bones out, those little metapodials, split it in half, make a bone needle, then you have the skin as well, and you can sew that skin into your garment. That was a really interesting light bulb moment for me, is that you could actually get a pretty nuanced view of how people were processing these animals down. And it's also a good indication that they were being trapped as well. One interesting thing that came out of review of this paper that I'd love to explore is that you can get biological sex out of the same Zooms method as well, using proteomics. And male bobcats and foxes are much more likely to be trapped than female bobcats and foxes, which I never really knew, but it's like this kind of universally accepted like behavioral thing. Males are just more, I don't know, they're more curious. They're more likely to get trapped in something. So we could go back to these same data and actually get sex out of it and bolster this case that these are trapped animals as opposed to like being hunted or something like that, just by based on the biological sex. So with that topic in particular, like there's still more to be gained from that. I think in general, LaPro, I mean, we have, I don't know, tens of thousands of artifacts to look at. There's chipstone raw materials from basically every corner of Wyoming. They all seem to be converging on this one site on the North Platte River near Douglas. That's going to be a really interesting thing to parse apart. About there's a group aggregation event, people coming from Southeast Wyoming, Southwest Wyoming, kind of meeting in a place and conducting this mammoth hunt together. There's also this interesting thing. This hasn't really been widely published yet, but we have both Clovis and Folsom artifacts, diagnostic artifacts at LaPro, seemingly in the same occupation, same exact stratigraphic context, same raw materials. So it's seeming like we have kind of a temporal relationship between those two diagnostics, which is a new thing. They've never really been found in the same context like this before. There's a lot of faunal analysis to do. We've got a bunch of bison bone and mammoth bone and bones of other animals to go through and reconstruct some of that. I don't know, there's a lot. I mean, I guess I released another paper last year about this results of auger testing that we did there, and it established that the site is huge, and we've really only scratched the surface. We've maybe excavated, I don't know, 4 or 5% of the site, and there's probably an enormous campsite just waiting there, 15 feet underground, for future archaeologists to explore. It's great. I mean, there's not really another site like it in North America where you have this really well preserved snapshot of Clovis and Folsom, I guess, life at the end of the Pleistocene. And it's gonna yield a lot of information for a long time to come.
Well, it certainly sounds like it. And again, if this is a gathering spot where we have multiple groups of people coming together, maybe for an annual hunt or a seasonal hunt, if you will, this could just be one of many kill sites that could be in that region. And now dropping the bomb, if you will, of the Folsom artifacts being there, made of the same materials and the same level, I really don't even know what to say about that. That's incredible. That could literally change our whole understanding of a lot of things that we think we know. So it certainly sounds like LaPro will be the gold standard for mammoth sites in the coming years. Again, with that many artifacts, I'm sure that you are more than busy to be able to stay on top of all of that, but I will definitely be looking forward to seeing what LaPro produces in the future. Again, we've been speaking tonight with Dr. Spencer Pelton. He is the Wyoming State Archaeologist. We look forward to more on LaPro. So Before we conclude tonight, I do want to talk about a couple of other things here briefly, one of which is your Substack newsletter known as Social Stigma. Now, this is a little bit different approach than what we've been talking about here tonight, but I want to give you an opportunity for anyone listening who may be interested in what you write about over there, which is the politics of heritage preservation. So talk a little bit about Social Stigma and what people can expect when they head over there.
Started Social Stigma like, I don't know, 2 years ago or so. Substack had just come out shortly before that, and I really liked the format. I like the opportunity it gave to people with self-published writing. And, I've been having a lot of conversations with friends and colleagues and stuff, and we just felt like there was kind of a niche to fill in terms of talking about our perspective on the past. So I get into a lot of different topics there. It's really archaeology focused, but I do talk more broadly about anthropology and biological anthropology and stuff there as well. I talk about stuff like we talk a lot about repatriation on it. It's a really controversial subject and a really nuanced one as well. And so I wanted an avenue to discuss that out in the open so that people could debate it and talk about it in a little more depth than we get from, say, just like, government regulations and things like that. I talk a little bit about federal regulations, new regulations, and how they impact the field of heritage management. Section 106 is something that a lot of people are interested and invested in archaeology, and I don't think people realize how kind of a tenuous regulatory and legal situation archaeology is in a lot of times. So I wanted an avenue to talk about some of those issues and really what butters our bread as archaeologists and how easily can it be taken away or not. So no, I go into a lot of different subjects. It's been fun to write. I've had a lot more time to do it when I was didn't have a 1-year-old in the house, but I still try to get out a post every month or so. And it inspires some good conversation both on that page itself and then through people texting me afterwards talking about stuff.
These type of outlets, places like Substack and Reddit and those type of things are always great to open up those conversations. We encourage everyone to check it out. Again, it is called Social Stigma. Dr. Pelton, if any of the listeners want to follow along with your other work, where's the best place for them to do that, whether it be social media or through papers that are being published? What direction would you send our listeners in?
I put all my research on my ResearchGate page. It's really easy to find. Just Google my name and ResearchGate and it pops right up. If anybody's ever interested in, volunteering on archaeological projects in Wyoming, I'm always looking for folks to come out. It's a long trip for a lot of folks I know, but every summer we're out on archaeology sites, and I primarily staff my projects with volunteers from the avocational community or people that don't get to do excavation every day. So yeah, reach out if you want to come out and work with us in Wyoming. We're always taking folks, and it's really fun. Go camp out in the middle of nowhere for a week and do some cool archaeology.
Yeah, I can attest to that. I've done it many times. It is certainly a great thing to do and a great way to learn. I've learned so much from doing that myself. So again, we want to thank Dr. Spencer Pelton, the Wyoming State Archaeologist, for joining us here tonight on the 7Ages Audio Journal. Dr. Pelton, you're always welcome back, and as those papers and that research on the Prele continue in the future, please keep in touch. Let us know about it so that we can bring you back on and keep everybody updated on this incredible site.
Will do. Thanks so much for having me, Jason.
Well, Micah, that's another fascinating interview that we've added to the library here at 7Ages. I just love talking to people who's out there doing the work, hands-on with something like a Clovis mammoth kill site. I mean, you just don't get that opportunity every day. Dr. Pelton was so gracious with his time, really went into detail on the site, and you'll definitely be hearing from Dr. Spencer Pelton again in the future. We've got a couple things in the works. So again, another great episode. I love this conversation. Anyone who has worked in the field of excavation, had hands-on experience like we've done here at 7Ages, That is a remarkable thing when anything's discovered, any artifact of any size. But, to imagine working on a Clovis aged mammoth kill site is absolutely incredible. And of course, Dr. Pelton, made it very clear to me that each summer they go out and they camp and they work on this site. And we have an open invitation to join them any summer. So keep that in mind as we move forward.
Yeah, I keep mentioning taking some time off at some point. And again, knowing me, what will happen is my quote unquote vacation will end up being, probably volunteering on an excavation site or something. This is kind of what I'd rather be doing in my spare time anyway. So stranger things, my friend. But again, the other thing that drives me to want to continue to do that, not having actually been out there hands-on in the field at an excavation now in a few years, it's that ongoing hope that at some point there will be some kind of a breakthrough discovery. I've always felt like this, I'm sure you have too, that, as far as the material remains left behind by the enigmatic Clovis techno-complex, we know a lot about the people of Paleo-Indian North America and South America. We know a lot about the potential migration routes. We know about what they hunted and subsisted off of. But there are still a lot of questions, a lot of intriguing ideas about, what their belief systems were, culturally speaking, what kinds of values they held, and what, other kinds of things we might potentially be able to glean from their life. Again, you look at those ichnofossils down there at White Sands. We get a glimpse at what Paleo-Indian, very early North American arrivals were using, apart from the stone tools, which are really so much still and always have been the focus, especially of American archaeology. So I hope that at some point there will be some kind of a discovery on par with Anzac 1, where we find something that just is a paradigm shift in what we know and how we are able to interpret what has been left behind by the Clovis. So yeah, that definitely still inspires me to want to be out there and be involved in archaeology. And for those who can't get out there and do excavations, again, excellent interviews like that one, Jason Pentrail. That is something that people can come, like you said, and they can enjoy. They can tap into the 7Ages library and experience a little of that archaeology and the wonder of the past for themselves. And I'll tell you what this also does, man, whether it's out there doing excavations or just talking on the mic, it works up quite a bit of thirst. So if you will join me now, as is always done at the conclusion of these sessions, please join me over here for one more round at the Crosstime Pub, good buddy.
It is a ritual, so we must partake.
Yes, we must. And of course, while we are partaking, those of you don't have to worry out there because there's still so much you can get caught up on, Jason. We also have the Patreon page, additional content for subscribers and supporters of the 7Ages team.
That's correct. So head on over to Patreon, type in 7Ages Podcast. There you'll find additional shows such as Digging Deeper. That is a no time limit show where we sit down and talk to guests about everything that we're interested in about their lives, their careers, archaeology, and everything associated with it. We also have the Green Dragon Book Club that we do once a month, and where we get into the details, really good conversations based around that. We also have the Crosstime Pub, which is more of a general archaeology show. Sometimes we have guests, sometimes we don't, but a little bit of everything for anyone interested in additional 7Ages content. And of course, anyone who wants to pick up that merchandise that says 7Ages on it. Over the years, people have asked for coffee mugs and for t-shirts and hoodies and all those wonderful things. So those are available at TeePublic, all one word, TeePublic. Head on over there and look for 7Ages Podcast, and you can see everything that we have to offer there as well. So those are a couple of ways that you can get a little additional content for the 7Ages team.
7Ages swag. And of course, in the days ahead, be on the lookout for that new mummy musk scented oil, something you can definitely look forward to. Just keep it away from my Guinness, all right? That's not something I want in this glass. All right, Jason, that wraps up another exciting installment as we go continuing our quest into the past, the prehistory of America, and, of course, glimpses at ancient cultures throughout the world. On behalf of Jason Pentrail, our friend geologist James Waldo, and yours truly, Micah Hanks, we are the 7Ages Research Associates, and we will catch you somewhere out there in time next time, right here on 7Ages.